meeting is being recorded.
So before I go ahead and turn to our handout, which if anybody tried to print it on regular size paper is probably close to illegible. I can do this. I do want to let you know it was originally formatted to be printed on 11 by 17 paper. So if you printed it out and you go, this is really tiny, that's why. If you have it on a device of some kind, you can blow it up as much as you want. This will be the last time I will see you guys in this format on Wednesday evenings for a while. We are going to have worship Wednesday nights at 7 throughout Lent. We invite everybody to join us, invite and encourage everyone to join us a week from tonight, March 2nd, for Ash Wednesday. We have a service at noon and a service at 7. Those services will be live streamed. And then the following Wednesdays during Lent, we will have Wednesday evening Lent services that Zach is coordinating. And we will have lay preachers bringing us the word. Those services will also be live streamed. We are going to have several groups, meeting throughout Lent to go through our series. Our series this year, we are using parts of the Alpha course, and we're trying to answer some big foundational questions about our faith. There will be a Sunday morning group meeting at about 9:45. There will be a Tuesday night group meeting at 6, a Wednesday morning group at 9, and a Saturday group meeting at 6 after worship. That group will not start the first weekend of Lent, but the following weekend. Information on all that went out in the midweek email today, so please keep your eyes peeled. We would love to have you be a part of any of those groups. If you want to be a part of all of them, go for it, but I would assume just being one is going to be good. So we're going to conclude our brief look at the Apostolic Age tonight. And we are going to look at some of the historical factors that led from the church growing from a handful of people in Galilee to becoming a force that is dominant in Western Europe, in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, Africa. How did we go from a small group that was kind of insignificant and persecuted to a group that actually wields a tremendous amount of power? We're going to blitz through approximately 400 years of history in just a hair over an hour. So everybody buckle up and hold tight. I see an electronic hand up. Yes.
Quick question. I wasn't on last week, but I did watch the recording of it, and I did it with the handout. And you did mention that you had an answer sheet to the table that you made for the view from inside the community.
Oh, yes.
Okay. So are you going to forward that to us? Because I made as many notes as I could, but I was kind of getting lost. I
can. Yes, I can send that out with the info that's going to go out maybe tomorrow, maybe on Monday. But yeah, I can attach that for people.
Sounds fantastic. Thank you.
Super. And of course, my thought was it is a teaching technique that if I encourage you to take the notes, it also uses you use your tactile sense and your visual sense as well as hearing it from me. So
Correct.
Yes, that was left blank on purpose.
Good.
But yeah, I now that we've all been there and done that, yes, I'd be happy to send that out to people. So your handout is two-sided. One side is a timeline. The other side is a little more detailed breakdown of that. And I will be offering a lot of verbal commentary in addition to what is there on your sheet. So we have Jesus born possibly in the year 4 BC. Historians go back and forth about when exactly Jesus was born, but he's born sometime around the shift from BC to AD. He lives approximately 30 years. He suffers under Pontius Pilate, is crucified, died, and was buried. On the third day, he rises again. And following the resurrection, 50 days, you have Pentecost. You have this festival where the Holy Spirit arrives, and the church just begins this explosive growth. These pilgrims who are in Jerusalem in Pentecost go and bring word of this event and this new thing that God is doing back with them all across the Roman Empire and possibly beyond. So obviously, the Holy Spirit is hard at work all through this era we're going to be talking about tonight. God has an amazing ability to take whatever people are doing and redeem it and co-opt it for God's purposes. We cannot forget that. What I want to look at tonight is how historical, political factors led, like I said earlier, from the church being this small group, originally something like 12, and, with some other people kind of outliers, to being the dominant force in the Mediterranean world and eventually far beyond. So, and at any point along the way, if you have questions or you would like me to speak extemporaneously on any of these topics further, I would be more than happy to do so. So we will start close to the beginning for our purposes with one of the first mentions we have that we're pretty sure is about Christians that comes from a non-Christian source. The Roman author Suetonius, who wrote in the early 2nd century, was writing about the middle of the 1st century. And he wrote a book called The 12 Caesars. Some of it is pretty accurate. Some of it is very National Enquirer, tabloid, sensational style stuff. So Suetonius, you need to take with a grain of salt. He's really entertaining, but not everything is totally accurate. Suetonius talks about, and we touched on this when we studied Romans, that in the mid-50s, he expelled the Jews from Rome. There was a lot of commotion and a lot of bad blood boiling up in the Jewish community on account of disputes over someone named Chrestus. We are pretty sure that they are talking about Christ. We are pretty sure they are talking about Jesus. And as we talked about when we studied Romans, it was a lot easier to identify the Jewish Christians culturally and ethnically. They were easier to pick out than the Gentile Christians, and the Jewish people were expelled from Rome. In the meantime, the Gentiles in the church stepped into leadership positions. When Nero's mother poisoned Claudius so that Nero could become emperor, the Julio-Claudians, there.
Did anybody else lose Pastor?
Yeah, I can't hear him.
No. I did too.
We can't hear you, Pastor.
Mr. Eric, your audio is gone.
What?
Your audio is gone.
My audio was gone?
Yeah,
What was the last thing you heard me say?
pretty much after the Romans were out, and that wasn't too much after that.
Okay. So Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome. Nero's mother poisoned Claudius so that Nero could become emperor, and Nero let the Jews come back to Rome. So one of the first things we find about the Christians in a non-Christian source is they don't blend in with everybody. Like there is conflict around this new religion almost from the get-go. Things are going well. Nero initially is very popular, and then he does go absolutely as nuts as everybody has been led to believe. He was out there. July 18th, 64, the Great Fire happened in Rome. A fire swept through large chunks of the city. Nero did not fiddle while Rome burned. The violin had not been invented yet. However, we do have accounts that Nero found a lyre, a little harp, and he started singing verses from the Odyssey and the Aeneid talking about Troy burning. Needless to say, his response to the disaster did not earn him a lot of accolades among the people, especially when people started saying, as soon as the fire was out, he cleared the places that burned so that he could start building a bigger palace for himself. That's all kind of suspicious. So Nero played a classic page out of the dictator's handbook. He said, you know what? There's actually a religious minority that is behind this. There are people who are different than us, and we don't really know them or trust them, and it's actually their fault. It was Christians that started this fire. So part of what he did was he said, we are going to have some great gladiatorial games where we will have some of these Christians fed to the lions, where we will have some of them fight to kill each other. And they decided to light our city on fire. So guess what? We're going to make some of them into human torches to light up these games. It is quite probable that Peter and Paul died during this persecution. Acts tells us that Paul was in Rome at this time. Paul's own letters indicate he wanted to go to Rome at this time. If traditions around Peter are reliable, he was in Rome around this time, and it would be pretty unlikely that people as high profile in the church as Peter and Paul would have escaped persecution. So that is the first place we know of where there is really officially sanctioned persecution of Christians, is around the Great Fire. Shortly thereafter, we have the Jewish Revolt against Rome, and we've touched on this in a number of different contexts. The long and short of it is that prior to the Jewish War, there were 4 main sects of Judaism, and the war eliminated 2 of them. It eliminated the Sadducees, who were tied to the temple. The temple got burned to the ground, so they were not a factor. There were the Essenes. They were the Dead Sea Scroll people, and most of them either died fighting or committed mass suicide, and you were left with the Pharisees and the Christians. The Pharisees were always interested in, how do we live faithfully? How do we interpret the law to apply to life every day? So suddenly, when that was the only way, at least in their book, to be faithful, they gained a lot of influence. And there were the Christians. They were not tied to the temple. They said, you know what, we can worship God wherever, because remember, God has sent the Holy Spirit. God's presence is with us anywhere we go. This accelerates the split between the temple, or between the synagogue and the church. Many of the Christians fled Jerusalem when the Jewish war started, but not many of them joined up with the Romans. So they didn't really lose or benefit based on the outcome of the war, but it did accelerate the split between church and synagogue, as both of these groups started saying, we are the genuine heirs of all these great promises God has made to God's people. So there are accounts of sporadic persecution and sporadic issues going on kind of between the year 73, when the Jewish war ends, and the next place we're getting to here. One of the significant ones happens around the year 100. We have a letter from the Emperor Trajan to Pliny, who is a governor in, I believe, Bithynia. It's somewhere in what's now Turkey. And Pliny writes to him and says, we have a lot of people who are coming in and reporting that their neighbors are Christians, and this is not okay. But it's getting a little out of hand. Like, we are having to arrest so many people that it's disrupting the flow of life. And Trajan wrote back and said, we're not going to take any anonymous accusations. And unless these Christians, they're weird, like they don't have all the things we usually think of with a religion, but unless they're actually causing problems, like something that they would be arrested for anyway, just leave people alone. That people need to bring actual evidence, and people need to make actual charges. They cannot just anonymously drop a note somewhere and say, so-and-so is a Christian, you should go get rid of them. So for quite some time, there was some kind of local persecution and local bad blood directed at Christians, but the policy coming down from Rome was kind of one of, if they're not causing problems, let's not make problems. That changes, and we will get to that. All right, we've gotten to the end of the 1st century here. Let me stop here. Questions, comments, concerns, insights? Okay. So we get into the 2nd century, and hold on just a moment. I forgot to bring down anything to drink. I just had to request that somebody bring me down some water since I'm talking so much.
I have one quick question on the
Yes.
on the Jewish war in around 70 AD. What was the primary thing that prompted that?
It had to do, I believe, primarily with issues of taxation, that the people in Palestine were being taxed extremely heavily, and people banded together and said, this is not okay. And they said, we think we have a good chance to throw these people out. So they rose up and took up arms against the Roman military, and they were ultimately unsuccessful in ejecting the Romans, but it had primarily to do with taxation and just the general heavy-handedness of Roman rule. Now, remember, you had people like Pilate. Pilate was fired for being too brutal and too cruel. So for the Romans to say someone is too brutal and too cruel, he had to be a first-class scumbag. So, I mean, those are the types of people who are ruling in this area. Yeah, people are going to have had enough of it at some point. So, one of the next things that's kind of an important thing to note, in the year 177 in Lyon, in what's now France, the church, from what we know there, was made up primarily of immigrants from Asia Minor. So you had strange people who kind of looked different and spoke a different language, and they brought their weird God and their weird religion with them. So, you kind of have some prime factors there for people starting to dislike these folks. It is possible that some of the persecution directed at Christians in Lyon had to do with the fact that they started running out of gladiators, and it was really easy to get criminals. And if being a Christian could be considered a criminal offense, that was a lot cheaper. So it could have come down to part of it being a desire for cheap entertainment. The way these things happen is really bizarre. So one of the things that came of that was the bishop was executed, and that brought Irenaeus into the picture. And we heard from him last week, and he's a very important theologian in defining what is a faithful understanding of the Christian faith as compared to what is not. So he came to prominence because he stepped into leadership in the wake of persecution. Along with that, you have the reign of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. And, approximately 60 years before, Trajan had said, we need a little higher standards if we are going to make Christianity a criminal offense. We need a little better standards for if we can charge people with that. Marcus Aurelius said, no, we don't. Just telling someone that so-and-so is a Christian is enough. So he really rolled back the standards that Trajan had set. But at this time, the persecution was all still directed at individuals. Communities as a whole were not being rooted out and attacked, but it was more individuals. when Marcus Aurelius died in 180, there was a period of relative peace and growth for the church. Like they kind of ran under the radar for a while. They just kind of got ignored, which was perfectly fine with them. And yet, again, the church continues to grow. The waters get a little choppier as we turn into the 3rd century. The Emperor Caracalla looked at the numbers and, you know, for as big as we are, and for as many expenses as we have, and as many bodies we need in uniform, we just do not have enough citizens. Part of the reason for that was Roman citizenship, if you were outside of Italy, was fairly difficult to get. That's why it was a big deal when Paul said, hey guys, by the way, you can't do this to me. I'm a Roman citizen. Here's my documents. And the people who were, you know, had him bound and chained said, oh dear, he is a Roman citizen. We can't do this to him. He has the right to go to the emperor. So Caracalla says, you know what? Most of these people living out in the provinces, all those people in Gaul and Hispania and Greece and Asia, Africa, I'm going to make them all citizens. This is fantastic. And it's the whole thing of sometimes converts are the most zealous. These people who have recently been granted their citizenship want to prove how Roman they are. And there is a resurgence of Roman nationalism. And along with that comes devotion to the traditional Greek and Roman gods, as well as to the emperor. So culturally, you have this move, you know, to really lift up and celebrate worshiping many gods and worshiping the emperor as a god. You also have an increasingly large chunk of the population that says, no, you can't do that. There's only one God. So you can see the potential for conflict continues to grow here. Okay, yeah, we're going to blitz through the 3rd century, then we'll stop and collect questions. So, just a moment here. The year 247, that trend of kind of a resurgence of Roman pride, it kind of reaches a peak. April 21st, 247. It is the 1000th anniversary of the foundation of Rome. The story goes that there are the 2 twins, Romulus and Remus, and they decide they want to found a city, and they can't decide what they're going to call the city, and Romulus solves the problem in a very Roman way. He kills his brother and says, we're going to name it Rome after Romulus. Isn't that convenient? But there are some Roman commentators at the time who say, you know, for 1,000 years, we've been very pious people worshiping the gods of our ancestors. Maybe the next 1,000 years of Rome are going to be all about worshiping Christ. Christianity is everywhere. Maybe it's going to be the dawn of a Christian era in Rome. So it's kind of interesting. You have these 2 streams flowing at the same time, this kind of surge in pride of Roman traditions, but also a realization that maybe Christianity is the future. So again, the potential for conflict continues to grow and expand here. Thereafter, you get the Emperor Odysseus, and he decides he wants to go and arrest bishops, and he orders a general sacrifice. He says, everybody in the empire is going to make a sacrifice to me as the emperor. Once again, when you have people who say, sorry, you're not a god, that is not just a freedom of religion thing, that's treason. And so you have a lot of Christians who are suffering as a result of that. His successor, Valerian, goes a step further. He bans Christian worship. He says, you people who get together on Sunday mornings and worship this guy from out in the sticks, no more. You do not get together and do that anymore. And he kicks it up a notch. He doesn't just arrest the bishops, he executes the bishops, he executes the elders, he executes deacons. So by the middle of the 3rd century, you're starting to see more wide-scale systematic persecution. of Christians. However, historical factors intervene. Valerian is killed fighting a war in the east, probably against the Parthians, and his successor, Gallienus, realizes that there are a ton of Christians living in the Roman Empire. They are a big chunk of the population. And in the eastern part of the empire, where all of their wars are being fought at the moment, they are an even bigger chunk of the people. So Gallienus realizes that if I can, Gallienus asks, why would I possibly want to alienate this big chunk of the population, especially when they are a huge chunk of the population right on the border with the people we're fighting against? Do I want to give these people reason to side against Rome in a conflict? So Gallienus ends the persecution. He just says all of these things. No, we're not arresting anyone else. We're not executing anyone else. Just forget about it. Let these people live in peace. We have no reason to believe he practiced the Christian faith. We have no reason to believe he was a pious, faithful person. He was, as so many of the Romans were, he was really practical. But if it's the difference between someone being arrested or not, at a certain point, it doesn't matter whether they're practical or pious. You still get to live your life in. So in the 260s, that later part of the 3rd century, Christianity continues to grow rapidly in Egypt and in North Africa. This is the breadbasket of the Roman Empire, Egypt in particular. That's one of the reasons why people fought over Egypt so much. That whole Nile Delta was just fantastically productive farmland. That fed a big chunk of the empire. Again, emperors understood we cannot alienate Christians because they are a huge part of the population there. So in the 260s, Christianity enjoyed kind of a respite from some of the challenges and persecution that it had faced earlier. By the time we get to 284, you have Diocletian, who becomes emperor. And he assesses the situation. The empire is near broke from fighting all kinds of wars on the frontiers. You have tension between these Christians and the people following the traditional religions. And he says, we are trying to maintain order from Britain and France and Spain into North Africa, all the way across both sides of the Mediterranean, all the way almost to the Tigris and Euphrates River. He says, this is not something that one person can effectively handle. So he takes out his map and he draws a line roughly at the northern end of the Adriatic Sea. So if you can picture the Mediterranean, you have the boot there with Italy. Everything from Italy west becomes one part of the empire. That becomes the Western Roman Empire. And that includes, kind of bring that line all the way south to Africa. So you have part of North Africa that becomes the Western Roman Empire. The Balkans, the Middle East, and Egypt become the Eastern Roman Empire. He splits it into two. And he says, not only are we going to split it into two, but we're going to have two ruling people in each one. We're going to have the Augustus, who is the top dog, and we're going to have the Caesar, who is his lieutenant, who is his second in command. So Diocletian takes the eastern part of the empire, where they speak Greek, and it tends to be the wealthier side of the empire. He reforms the economy. He also splits the empire into areas called dioceses. So if that term is ringing a bell from anybody, particularly anyone who grew up in the Roman Catholic tradition, that's where it comes from. The Roman emperor cut the empire up into geographical units called dioceses, and at one point the church took over the diocese and says, well, each of these places is going to have a bishop. So Diocletian kind of ends the skid that the empire has been in for a while, and he kind of gets things back on the rails, gets things going. We have kind of made it to the end of the 3rd century here. Let me stop. Questions, concerns, insights, comments? Hold on a second. Gail, you have to unmute yourself.
Okay,
There you are.
there I am. All right. Do we know if one of the disciples went down to Africa? I mean, how did Africa get this large group of Christianity going? Other than there being on the river, on the trade routes.
Tradition says that Mark, the evangelist, went to Alexandria. I don't remember off the top of my head. I feel like there is a tradition that at least one of the 12 apostles went to Africa. You had mentioned trade routes. That is the most likely explanation of how Christianity got to Africa. And remember, Africa is not that far. And when we're talking about Africa for these purposes, we're talking about North Africa, primarily the Mediterranean coast. So it is not really that far from Jerusalem. It's not really that far from Galilee. And of course, there's a lot of trade in and out of Egypt. And you also have the people who are coming back on pilgrimage from Pentecost. There's a big Jewish community in Alexandria. There's Jewish communities in Carthage. They carry that with them all the way across North Africa. But in terms of which, there are traditions that one of the apostles went to Africa, but I don't remember who tradition says it was. It's not in the Bible, I can tell you that.
Okay.
Wasn't there one of the apostles though that like appeared to an Ethiopian?
You are absolutely right, Mark. And that is in the Bible. Philip,
Yes.
the
Philip.
deacon, is on his way between, no, the Ethiopian is on his way between Jerusalem and Gaza. And the Holy Spirit tells Philip, go talk to that guy. The Ethiopian is already reading the book of Isaiah. And Philip interprets the book and says, hey, you see all this suffering servant stuff, all of this God's Messiah stuff? It's talking about Jesus. So, yes, Mark, you are absolutely right. How I could have missed that is beyond me, but that's why we're a community. So yes, right there, we do have an account of somebody who embraces the Christian faith and is baptized and goes on his way back to Africa. So there, I love it. Thank you. So things are going along at this point somewhat smoothly for Christianity. And one of the nice things about this era in history is we have a lot of historians at work and a lot of documentation. So we actually have dates for a lot of things. February 23rd, 303. Diocletian has been emperor for 19 years, and he has more or less been at peace with the Christians. And February 23rd, he sends out a bunch of imperial edicts. He says, we're going to burn all the Christian scriptures. We're going to dismantle their churches, both any buildings they have as well as the communities. And worship is hereby banned. If you are a government officer or in the military and you're a Christian, you are losing your job. And Christians will not be allowed to be plaintiffs in court. If you have a dispute and you want the legal system to handle it, you're not going to have that option anymore. He follows this up not that much later with the arrest of bishops and clergy who were given the choice of sacrificing to the emperor or being executed. Off the top of my head, and if I would have known, I certainly would have written it on here. We're not 100% sure what made Diocletian decide that day that Christianity had to go, but decide he did. So often when people are talking about persecution, this is like the end all be all in the early church. This was across the entire empire, enforced with the full weight of the Roman imperial government. Diocletian gets ill and he retires tradition has it, or historical accounts have it, that he retired to the Balkans and had a big house, and he liked to grow cabbages. And Galerius was his successor, and he said, you know, for the good of our empire, I'm ordering a general sacrifice. Everybody's going to sacrifice to the emperor, because the emperor is divine, and we want all of the gods to be happy. And he says, this is everybody. This is not just clergy. This is not just bishops. Everyone in the Roman Empire will make a sacrifice. And the penalty for refusing was death or being enslaved in the mines. So the persecution really reaches right into each and every Christian household. So things are really looking bad for the church right at this moment. The very next year, in the western part of the empire, so the western side there, Constantius was the emperor, and he dies. He is succeeded by his son. His son is named Constantine. So the period between Constantine becoming emperor and the year 312, we have a stretch of about 7 years, not only of conflict within the western half and conflict within the eastern half of the empire. People are duking it out to see who's going to be ruler of each side. But each side of the empire is kind of trying to jockey for position to be more powerful than the other. So you have civil war in each half, and then you have the two halves kind of at odds with each other. So Constantine is a very capable military commander. And he, in October of the year 312, he is closing in on capturing Rome. And if he captures Rome, he wins the civil war, and he becomes the emperor of the West. He has a dream. And in his dream, he sees his army fighting, and all of his soldiers have crosses painted on their shields. And this is bizarre. This would be like having nooses or electric chairs painted on your military equipment. But Constantine also understands that these Christian people believe in a guy who was crucified and then was raised to life. And in his dream, a voice says, "In hoc signo vinces," in this sign you will conquer. And he takes that to mean that this God, this Christian God, is inviting him to conquer. So he has his soldiers paint crosses on their shields, and October 26th, 27th, and 28th, he fights a battle at the Milvian Bridge in Rome, and he dominates. Constantine is now the sole emperor in the West. February of the year 313, so we're talking a couple of months later, he's kind of settled things down in the West. He signs the Edict of Milan. The Edict of Milan officially makes the western half of the Roman Empire, gives them freedom of religion. He says, you can worship whatever you want, whoever you want, however you want. Interestingly enough, word of Constantine's victory that he credits the Christian God with spreads east. And Licinius, who was his ally in the east, starts to clamp down on the church in the east, because he says, I don't want all these Christians thinking that Constantine is, God's servant. I don't want the Christians to support him. I like being emperor of the east. I don't need that. Well, that leads to more conflict, and on September 18th, 324, Constantine defeats Licinius, and once again, after a period of about 40 years, you have one emperor again, Constantine. He's defeated all his rivals in the West. He has defeated all his rivals in the East. He is the man. Constantine is a very savvy politician, and he says, I do not want to go down the road of having a bunch of conflict bubble up again. What can I do? What is going to be the glue that is going to hold this empire together? It's not a common language. It's not a common identity in terms of ethnic ties, but maybe the glue that can hold us together is a common faith. Constantine summons the bishops from all the important places in the Roman Empire and says, May 20th, 325, be there or you don't want to know. So he gathers these bishops from across the empire. He says, you're all going to hang out in Nicaea, which is right outside of Constantinople, which is his capital. And he says, I want you guys to hash out some of these doctrinal disputes that I understand are going on in the church, because I want the faith to be something that unites us. I want the faith to be consistent from the Tigris and the Euphrates all the way over to Britain. And so what comes from that is, as we touched on last week, the Nicene Creed. At that time, the big questions out there were about who is Jesus and how are we saved? That's why the Nicene Creed has that long article, that long second article that spells out in a lot of detail who is Jesus. So Constantine is baptized on his deathbed, and he has gone down as one of the people who has really advanced the spread of Christianity. His mother, Helen, was a Christian, and whatever Constantine may or may not have been sincere in his faith, we don't know. We know his mother, Helen, was. Helen, once her son was the emperor, embarked on a tour of the Holy Land. And she said, I want you people to show me where all of these things in the New Testament happened. And when they found the places, she said, you're going to build a church here. So many of the churches we have in the Holy Land now, maybe not the current buildings, but the sites, many of them were discovered and had a shrine or a church built on it originally by Constantine's mother, Helen. When your son is the emperor and you have unlimited resources, you can do a lot of traveling and do a lot of building. So it seems like now the emperor is a Christian. The emperor's mother is a Christian. The emperor has said, we are going to promote this faith as something to hold us together as an empire. It would seem that everything is going like gangbusters for the church. This is great. What could possibly go wrong? Well, what could go wrong was the reign of Julian. Some historians refer to him as Julian the Apostate. Apostate, of course, being a word people in the church like to apply to people who, well, don't share their faith. Julian was born to a Christian family, but he rejected Christianity in the year 347. He did a lot of studying. He studied classical literature. He studied Greek philosophy, and he said, you know, I like the old ways better. This is where it's at. Interestingly enough, most of the male members of his family were murdered on orders from Constantine's son, who was his cousin. So he is related distantly to Constantine. So it may very well be that it was not only his appreciation of the ancient Greek and Roman stuff, but when people who are very loud and proud about being Christians come and kill a lot of your family, it probably probably does not paint the Christian faith in its best light. Whatever the case may be, Julian knew a lot about Christianity, but did not, he rejected it as a faith. He was a very successful general, and when Constantius II died in 361, the military proclaimed him emperor. In his very short reign of 2 years, he did a lot. He realized that the church at this point and Christianity were too deeply entrenched and too powerful just to do as previous emperors had done and say, well, we're just going to persecute all the Christians, because that would have ripped apart the ranks of the military and the government. But Julian went about it in a little different way. He set about to weaken the church. He pulled a page out of the Julius Caesar playbook. All of the clergy who had been exiled because their teachings were deemed unfaithful, he brought them all back. So he sowed seeds of conflict within the church. He played the divide and conquer card. He banned Christians from becoming teachers. He said, I'm not going to let these people teach so that they can spread their faith. He said, one of the places where the church is really admired and one of the places that gets them a lot of people's interest is that they take care of the poor. They take care of the widow. They take care of the orphan and the outcast. Julian founds charities to do these same things, and he puts pagan priests in charge of them. So suddenly he says, well, the church isn't the only game in town. We believe in ethical action too. He also tried to make the priests of all the other gods adopt Christian-style ethical standards. He also, in an attempt to exploit that split between church and synagogue, tried to rebuild the Jerusalem temple, but was not able to because of an earthquake. I don't know whether anybody interpreted that as a sign from God. But he very quickly, in 2 years, sowed a lot of seeds to try and weaken the church. He only had 2 years because he was killed while fighting against the Parthians. So, but just in 2 years, Julian made some moves that, had they gone on longer, could have reshaped history quite a bit. However, he didn't have enough time to do that. I think that's good. And in the year 381, the Emperor Theodosius I calls another council. He calls the bishops from all around the empire, and he says, I like what you guys did at Nicaea, but now we have some disagreement over what the Holy Spirit does. So if you remember, we talked about previously, the Nicene Creed, as it was originally written, just ended with saying, we believe in the Holy Spirit. One line, period. What we say in church today, of course, we believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life. It's much more in depth. That is what was added on at this Council of Constantinople. So to be fully accurate, what we say in certain seasons of the church here is not the Nicene Creed, but the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, which, as you can see, I was really concentrating on pronouncing that word, which is why we usually just call it the Nicene Creed. A very important event happens in the year 384. In the year 384, a group of people in Rome start a campaign to restore the altar to the goddess Victory. They look around and they say, we used to be winning a lot of wars and a lot of battles. Things have been not going real well for us lately. It seems to have correlated with when we stopped worshiping the goddess Victory, and this altar has fallen apart. And they approach the Emperor Valentinian and they say, Emperor, we should really think about rebuilding this altar and starting to worship the goddess Victory again. Ambrose, who is also well known as being very important in St. Augustine's faith journey, hears about this. And he goes and he debates the emperor. So, first of all, the notion that the emperor would bother to debate someone is very noteworthy. Roman emperors, on the whole, didn't do debate. They said what they wanted done, and people did it. So just the fact that the bishop could go and debate the emperor says something about the growing influence and power of the church. And Ambrose then goes and says, by the way, emperor, if you decide you want to get behind building an altar to another god, we're going to excommunicate you. We will throw you out of the church and you will not get communion. And the emperor says, I think Ambrose is right. So for the first time, you have someone from the church wielding enough authority of some kind to push the emperor around, to bring the emperor around to his perspective. So that dynamic of leaders in the church having the power to influence, if not dictate, to secular leaders. This is one of the cornerstones of the medieval era, and it is in place starting with Ambrose. In the year, let me stop there. We've reached the end of the 4th century. Questions, comments, concerns, insights? So getting into the 5th century, in the year 410, Alaric the Visigoth brings his Visigothic people down from Northern Europe. So maybe some of these were some of our ancestors, possibly. They go down and they defeat whatever Roman military they encounter, and they get to Rome. And they show up and they say, wow, there's a lot of nice stuff here. I think it would look great back home. And they proceed to spend quite a bit of time looting and pillaging and burning Rome. For centuries, the thought that a foreign power could invade Italy and attack Rome was completely unthinkable. So when Rome is attacked and parts of it are burned down by a foreign invader, that is a really watershed moment for people. And it is around this time that Augustine writes City of God, and he talks about there's the city of God and the city of man, and this idea that what we have always known as the seat of power is no longer the seat of power we once knew, is really kind of shakes people's view of the world. So that's really significant. It's also significant for something that happens sometime later. In the year 451, we have the Council of Chalcedon. That deals with what exactly is Jesus like? What is the nature of Jesus? What's noteworthy about the Council of Chalcedon is that it is the first council where the Bishop of Rome is really in a preeminent place, where other bishops show deference to the Bishop of Rome. Most of the councils prior to this, the bishops were more or less a group of equals, but by the time 451 comes around, the Bishop of Rome is, at least in the West, considered the highest ranking bishop. He is the one who has more authority than the other bishops. So this idea that the Bishop of Rome is special, that the Bishop of Rome has particular authority over and above that of other bishops, that is now in place by the year 451. So another one of those cornerstones of the medieval era. In 410, Alaric came and sacked Rome. In 452, Attila the Hun is on his way down to Rome, and Pope Leo, of fame from the Council of Chalcedon, leaves Rome and goes out and meets Attila outside Rome and convinces him not to attack the city. One of the other aspects of the Middle Ages is that the Pope is not just a spiritual leader, he is a very powerful secular leader as well. He has a lot of real world, right here, right now power. The fact that a Pope could turn an invading army away from Rome, probably through a combination of negotiation and paying tribute, but the fact that the Pope had that kind of power is very significant. That would usually be the purview of, say, the emperor, but the emperor by this point does not have anywhere near that kind of power. The Pope does. And so it is only a matter of time until September 4th, 476. There is a young man, possibly still a boy, named Romulus Augustulus. After a succession of many different people being emperor for little short chunks of time, he becomes emperor. Interestingly enough, he is named for Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome, and for Augustus, the founder of the Roman Empire. And Augustulus is like a diminutive form, like little Augustus. Romulus Augustulus is the Roman emperor, and Odoacer, one of the barbarians who has invaded Italy, calls the emperor to Ravenna and says, "Sorry, emperor, you're out of a job." So the Roman Empire in the West officially ceases to be an entity. And so in Western Europe, at least, you have no imperial government. You have a lot of little small kingdoms and princedoms and fiefdoms. I had a history teacher who called things like that confetti states, because if you were to color code them on a map, it would look like somebody dropped confetti on it. But yet, at the same time, you had the church. You had an organized, large-scale entity that had wealth, that had influence, that was centralized. They had a leader in Rome who could make a call, could decide something, and that decision would be binding across a lot of territory. So rather than an emperor and a government, you had a pope and a church. So with that, we get into the Middle Ages. And as a classicist by training, I don't do Middle Ages. So let me stop there. Questions, comments, concerns, thoughts, insights?
I think it's fairly interesting that there were a number of times during these 5 centuries where the church could have been exterminated, and yet something always happened where it didn't. And a lot of times the despot that was causing the issue met some untimely demise quickly, and you just can't help but think that maybe God was the one in control here to kind of nurse things along, not really unlike some of the stories that occurred in the Old Testament with the survival of the Jews from the time of Abraham.
Yeah, I think particularly of the defeat of the Babylonians by the Persians. Cyrus is referred to as a Messiah. Cyrus, who is not Jewish, is not an Israelite. He is a Persian. He comes in and he defeats the Babylonians and tells the Jews who are in Babylon, you are free to go home and worship your God again. So somebody outside of Israel, somebody outside of the faith is explicitly called a Messiah, is called an anointed one sent by God to help God's people. And we see that time and again throughout this. I would argue that you see that at play in the Reformation. If Suleiman the Magnificent was not banging at the gates of Eastern Europe, the Holy Roman Emperor probably would have had a lot more time, energy, and military to deal with the Reformation than he actually had. But there he was.
We just got back from Rome actually a week ago. So we spent 10 days there, and I was reading a travel book, and we took a tour of the Vatican and everything else. And they had said that there's like over 900 churches in Rome. And as I was reading some of the pilgrimage sites, this kind of when you talked about Helena, when she had an unlimited budget, there's a church there that claims to have the steps from Herod's palace as a pilgrimage site. There's another church that claims to have splinters of wood from the cradle in Jesus' birthplace. You know, we saw St. Peter in Chains Church, which is amazing. And
Yeah.
all of those little things, you know, they each have some sort of little artifact or something from the Holy Land. And I was thinking, you know, this is what Helena did to preserve and to promote that faith. And again, she had an unlimited budget. She could pull that off. So and it's been
Must be
preserved.
nice.
Yeah, it's been preserved for, you know, a couple thousand years. And without her influence, it would have never happened. You know, and I can only assume that, you know, given all this time, you know, people can say, well, you really think that's real? You know, what's there? Well, you know, it certainly withstood the test of time. You know, people have been believing it for an awfully long time. And I would have to say, as we talk about, you know, the influence of God's hand in a lot of things that preserved the church over the years, I don't see why not, why they couldn't be genuine. And so I thought it was amazing.
And I think at a certain point, if these things build up faith, if these things strengthen people and encourage them, that's great. When you get into some of the later medieval things where they said, you know, you can go on a pilgrimage and you can pay to see this thing, and that'll buy you a little bit of God's forgiveness. That becomes a lot more problematic.
Yeah.
But, you know, was that really a splinter of wood from the manger? We don't know. Did that get you thinking about how amazing it is that the God who created the universe was once a helpless child held in this small wooden box, and contemplate that? If it did that, then you know what? That's not the worst thing. Other thoughts, other questions? Oh, Gail, you'll have to unmute yourself.
It wants me to be quiet, I guess. They kept eliminating the upper people in the church 10 years prior to this. How did we all of a sudden get a pope?
Well, that is a fascinating question. It seems to be that whenever someone was eliminated by whatever means, or that, you know, sometimes people just died of natural causes, someone else was elected or stepped into that role of leadership. So there was probably from an early time a good amount of continuity in leadership in the church in Rome and in most places. When they started becoming the Pope is kind of an interesting thing. I'm not sure exactly when the title started being used, but the idea in Latin, the Pope is the Pontifex Maximus, the highest priest. That used to be a title held by the Emperor of Rome. So at some point along the way, the Bishop of Rome became so powerful that he was able to tell whatever emperor at the time, by the way, you're no longer Pontifex Maximus. That's me. So when that happened, I'm not exactly sure. It may be people such as Leo. He may not have referred to himself as Pope, but looking back from our position now, we would apply that name to him. But yeah, it was originally a title used by the emperors. And again, I think it kind of goes to show the amount of influence that the church gained, that they were able to take a title reserved for the emperor and apply it to themselves.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, if that is everything that we wanted to cover tonight, it is certainly everything I wanted to cover tonight. I thank you for your willingness to go along with me on this fast trot through a couple centuries of history. I thank you for indulging my need to use some of my classics background tonight. So hope everybody got something useful and good from this. And why don't we close our time together tonight praying the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Well, thank you everyone for being here. Blessings on your evening, and we will see everybody soon.
Good night, everyone.
Pastor.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Very welcome.
Good
Take
night.
care. Good night.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Night.
Good night.